What is going on, everyone? Today we're going to be doing a spoiler-free review for Saw X. I'm sorry this is a few days late. I didn't get a chance to seeing the movie a couple days after because I went to see The Creator. Both the movies came out the same day, and I chose to see The Creator first, even though I was more excited for Saw, to be honest, because although this is a franchise I'm not like absolutely crazy about, there was something about that trailer that just really looked very entertaining, and I was like, okay, this might actually be one of the better Saw movies, and lo and behold, I was correct. Now, of course, that doesn't mean this movie's perfect, so let's go through all the positives and the negatives, and then we'll give the movie a score out of 10 in the end. So first of all, starting with the positives, there's actual good story to this film, which is kind of rare for Saw movies. A lot of them just, a lot of people call it like torture, PORN, and I don't necessarily think that's the case for most of them, but there are a few that kind of are teetering on that line where the main sole purpose of the movie is just to gross you out. There's a couple of them like that, and the main focus is obviously the traps. Let's see how crazy and just messed up we can make these traps. This one, though, I just don't really feel like this one did that. I really do feel like this one had a main focus on John Kramer and his character. It was essentially a psychological character study on him, which I think was really needed because this is obviously the main focus of the franchise. Even though he, spoiler, dies after the third movie, he was still such a main focus even on the movies later on because they kept having him back in flashbacks and everything like centered around him usually, even with his apprentices. So it made sense to do a movie that just focuses on him as a character, and of course we kind of learn his whole motivations in prior films, but we don't really get to explore it the way we do in this film, and it works really well. And even like the first half of the film, it's mainly just showing him on this journey of trying to get treated for cancer, and he goes to Mexico for it. You saw this all in the trailer, and of course it ends up being a scam, and that's essentially what this whole plot is based around, him trying to, get these people who scammed him into the traps, and we get to see his full philosophy on display where he believes that if he can get these people in traps and they can try to fight their way to live, and if they actually end up living, then he thinks they deserve to live because he basically is giving them a second chance if you fight hard enough to really want to live, which goes perfectly with his character because of course he has cancer and he finds this new appreciation for life, and he thinks a lot of people are ungrateful and don't appreciate life enough, and if they are able to survive these traps, then that proves that they are grateful and they do want to live, and that might make them change how they live. It's a very interesting philosophy, and it's actually explored very heavily in this movie, whereas prior films I don't feel like explore it enough. Saw 3 kind of did to a degree, especially with Amanda having a very different philosophy, and you get to see that in this movie a little bit, but Amanda, of course, because this takes place between Saw 1 and 2, she's a bit different than she was in Saw 3, and you get to see kind of her character and how some of her morals are a bit different than John Kramer. And a lot of those conversations are honestly some of the best parts of this movie. The main focus is not even on the traps. It's not based on the gore, even though that stuff is there and it's great. It's based on the story itself, and that is the purpose of this movie, which is really a good way to do it. And that also is really important because for his trap victims in this movie, you understand why each and every one of them is there. There were some other Saw movies, mainly the ones without John Kramer, where it was either Amanda or Hoffman doing the traps. A lot of the time, you don't really fully get why the character is in that situation, and you're sitting there going like, they didn't do anything wrong, or they did, and it wasn't like anything that big. But this movie, like, you understand why all the characters are there, some of which you don't fully agree with, but you understand why John is still making them do it. Of course, I'm not going to spoil the examples of that, but there are certain characters where you don't feel like they're a bad person, they were just mixed up in something bad, and there's actual conversations and dialogue surrounding that, and characters questioning why is this person here if they weren't really a bad person to begin with. But it's much better than, in like Saw 7, for them to literally have a character who is completely innocent get killed for what reason? Nothing really, just because she happened to be, with someone who did bad things. It just didn't make much sense. Also, just from a filmmaking standpoint, it's a really well-made movie. It's really well-paced. The writing is all very good. Dialogue is great. The acting is some of the best we've seen in the franchise. Actually, I would say it is the best we've seen in the franchise. So there's a lot of great things here. Obviously, Tobin Bell as John Kramer is the standout. He gives the best performance I've ever seen from him. So yeah, A lot of great things to watch for this movie. The locations are cool. Going to Mexico was very different than what we're used to. So if you are a big fan of the Saw movies, you're going to love this one. And even if you're not a big fan of the Saw movies, you probably might still like this one. It's definitely just a good movie in general. But then we're going to get to a couple of mixed things. And I don't usually do a mixed segment in these reviews, but this one I felt like I had to. So a huge mixed thing for me was the fact that this movie is very different than a lot of the other Saw ones in terms of how personal this is for John Kramer, right? It's so personal that the actual trap victims themselves get to see John Kramer face to face. Obviously, in the older Saw movies, it used to be they'd wake up in a room completely alone, and then on the TV, Billy the Puppet would show up and would be, talking the game through it. So from the victim's perspective, they don't know that John Kramer's doing it. They just see this puppet and they're just terrified by it. But in this one, John Kramer's literally like standing right in front of them, just talking to them. And it's very different. And I understand why they did it because of how much more personal it is. And it does allow Tobin Bell to have more of a spotlight as John Kramer in this film. But it definitely took away from the creepiness and the scare factor because it's not nearly as scary as it would be to wake up and see Billy the Puppet talking to you on a TV screen. Like, that's just a very different thing. They do have Billy the Puppet in this movie. Obviously, he was in the trailer. But it's just not as terrifying as I feel like it has been in prior films. And I get why they did it, which is why I'm putting it in the mix, and I think it has a purpose. I just personally didn't like it. Another big thing I'm going to put in the mix is the traps themselves, because the traps themselves are good. Like, I don't think they're bad. I just think there's a couple of elements to them that are really just Like, first of all, they're not that interesting. Like, compared to the traps we've seen before, I felt like they weren't as interesting. They didn't have as many unique elements to them. A lot of them were, and I'm not going to spoil the traps, but a lot of them were as simple as like cut off a limb and or you die, basically. Like, it's as simple as that. We've seen traps like that before, it's nothing that different, nothing new. There's a couple that were very unique. Obviously, the one that was on the poster with the eyes getting sucked out of those tubes, like that one's very unique. But there's just not many ones in this movie that I was like, okay, that is really cool. But what I do like about them and why I'm putting it in the mixed is because all of them, and I mean every single one of them, you do see that there is a possible way for them to survive this. A lot of the Saw movies before, especially like I said, the ones where it was either Amanda or Hoffman doing the traps, a lot of them, there's like, okay, there's no way that person could have survived. And you're just sitting there like, well, that's a dumb trap because no one could have survived that. But in this one, you can genuinely see, yeah, people could have survived that. They could easily survive that. And that definitely makes, not easily, that's a, let me go back on that. Definitely not easily. But you can see that they could survive these traps. You don't see it as impossible. And there's actually one in particular that I think was one of the easiest to survive traps we've ever seen in Saw, although it still was really messed up and would really leave you mortally wounded. But I think that just makes for some more interesting games for these characters. And so I personally enjoyed the traps regardless of me thinking they're not that unique compared to what we've seen before. And into the negatives, I only really have one thing to say which kind of connects to the traps. And that's the fact that they were very unrealistic in terms of, not the traps themselves, but in terms of how the characters reacted to it. And I'm not going to say this is like the acting that was bad. I think it's probably just, they just didn't think people would care, which most people definitely don't care. A lot of people are going to tell me in the comments, oh, it's a movie, who cares? It's supposed to be unrealistic. But I think a certain level of realism to the wounds that these characters get is important. And if a character chops off their leg, and it's just like, they don't even look like they just chopped off their leg. Like they look like they're chilling, It's a little like, okay, like they would have passed out, you know what I mean? Certain things like that where you just feel like, how could a character possibly have gone through that without either passing out or being like just screaming in pain? Of course, there's always shock, some people go in shock and they don't really feel it as much as they would otherwise. But that's usually when it was like very much like someone blow their leg off with a shotgun or something. Like they didn't even see it coming. That's usually when shock happens. But if they're doing it themselves and it's a very slow process, they're likely going to pass out or at least be, in agonizing pain. And sometimes these characters did not really look like they were in agonizing pain. A couple of them did, but a lot of them didn't as well. So for that, I think, yeah, okay, they definitely could have changed around some things quite a bit. But that's the only negative I really could say. Most of the other things, like I mentioned, were in the mixed segment and I saw the good in them, so I didn't really mind them too much. I'm going to give this movie an 8.4 out of 10. It's a very solid Saw film, and I will be doing a Saw ranking very, very shortly so you can see my entire list. But yes, it is one of the better Saw films. It is definitely worth seeing if you are a fan of Saw, or even if you're not. Go see this movie. Definitely my favorite horror film of 2023 so far. Surprisingly, I did not expect that to be the case. Hopefully there's more horror films that'll come out later down the line this year that could be even better, but currently this is probably my favorite horror movie of this year. So let me know your guys' thoughts in the comment section below. Let me know if you enjoyed this movie, or let me know if you didn't. If you haven't seen it, are you going to go see it? I will see you on my next one. Peace out.